Democracy, it's a word we hear constantly, a system many of us live under, but how often do we stop to think about where it all began? What if I told you that the roots of democracy stretch back over 2,500 years, long before the founding fathers or modern parliaments? It wasn't born in grand halls or through sweeping revolutions, but rather in the humble, bustling streets of ancient societies, where ordinary people first began to demand a say in how they were governed. Think of democracy not as a modern invention, but as a seed planted in the fertile soil of early civilizations, slowly growing and adapting over centuries. Why does this matter to us today, in a world where democratic principles are both celebrated and fiercely debated? Understanding where they came from can shed light on where we're headed. What can ancient societies teach us about fairness, equality, and the power of collective decision-making? How did early forms of democracy emerge in places where kings and emperors once held absolute power? These are the questions we'll explore together. In this video, we'll journey back to the origins of democracy, uncovering how ancient societies from the city-states of Greece to the tribal councils of indigenous peoples laid the groundwork for the systems we rely on today. You'll discover surprising parallels between the past and present, and perhaps even see our modern challenges in a whole new light. So, let's dive into the fascinating story of how democracy took its first steps, and how those early experiments continue to shape our world. Picture this, a sprawling city along the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, bustling with traders, artisans, and farmers. This was Uruk, one of the world's first cities, emerging around 4,500 years ago. But beyond its towering ziggurats and bustling markets, Uruk was also home to something revolutionary, a system of shared governance that would plant the seeds for democracy as we know it today. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the idea of collective decision-making began to take root. City councils and assemblies played a crucial role in managing resources, resolving disputes, and ensuring the community thrived. These weren't democracies in the modern sense. Power was often concentrated among elites, but they introduced the concept that decisions could be made collectively, rather than by a single ruler. Historian Paul Kruiksek describes Mesopotamia as a laboratory of human governance, where the complexities of urban life demanded new ways of organizing society. These early systems were far from perfect, but they marked a profound shift in how people thought about leadership and accountability. And while Mesopotamia's experiments in governance were groundbreaking, they were just the beginning. Other ancient societies, inspired by these early models, would soon take the idea of shared governance even further. Long before the rise of empires and kingdoms, small communities were already experimenting with ways to govern themselves fairly. Tribal councils, often found in hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies, served as some of the earliest forms of collective decision-making. These councils weren't about kings or rulers passing down power through bloodlines. Instead, leaders were chosen based on their abilities, wisdom, or the trust they earned from their people. It was a system built on merit and consensus, where the voices of many mattered more than the ambitions of a few. Take, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy, a powerful alliance of Native American tribes in what is now the northeastern United States. Their great council operated on principles that might feel familiar to us today. Chiefs were selected not by birthright but by their skills in diplomacy, negotiation, and their ability to serve their communities. Decisions were made through lengthy discussions, with each tribe having an equal say, ensuring that no single group could dominate the others. Similarly, in many African clans, elders played a crucial role in governance, guiding their people through shared wisdom rather than autocratic rule. These systems weren't perfect, but they reflected a deep understanding of the importance of balance and cooperation. What's striking about these early forms of democracy is how they prioritized the needs of the community over individual power. Leaders weren't seen as rulers but as servants of the people, tasked with maintaining harmony and addressing collective challenges. This stands in stark contrast to the hierarchical systems that would later dominate much of the world. Yet, even as societies grew larger and more complex, the seeds planted by these tribal councils would eventually take root in more structured democratic systems. From the Iroquois to the clans of Africa, these early experiments in shared governance remind us that the desire for fairness and representation has always been a part of human history. As we move forward, we'll see how these ideas evolved in ancient civilizations, giving rise to more formalized systems of democracy that continue to shape our world today. But for now, it's worth reflecting on how these early communities laid the groundwork for something truly revolutionary, a belief that power should belong to the people, not just the privileged few. In the heart of ancient Greece, Athens stood as a beacon of political experimentation, giving birth to a radical idea that still echoes today: direct democracy. Unlike the representative systems we're familiar with, where elected officials make decisions on our behalf, Athens took a bold approach. Here, ordinary citizens, those who qualified as such, gathered in the agora, the bustling public square, to debate, vote, and shape the laws that governed their city. This wasn't just a system, it was a living, breathing exercise in collective decision-making, where every eligible citizen had a voice and a vote, but who exactly could participate? Athens' democracy, while groundbreaking, was far from inclusive. Only adult male citizens, those born to Athenian parents, were granted the right to take part. Women, slaves, and foreigners, no matter how long they'd lived in the city, were excluded entirely. This meant that while Athens prided itself on being a democracy, the reality was that a significant portion of its population had no say in its governance. Aristotle himself, one of the most influential thinkers of the ancient world, observed this contradiction, noting that while democracy aimed to empower the people, it often failed to represent all of them equally. The Athenian assembly, or ecclesia, was the heart of this system. Thousands of citizens would gather several times a month to debate issues ranging from war and taxes to public works and religious festivals. Decisions were made by majority vote, often after heated discussions. Imagine standing in a crowd of thousands, hands raised, deciding the fate of your city in real time. It was democracy in its purest, most immediate form, but it wasn't without its flaws. The system relied heavily on the active participation of its citizens, and when attendance waned, decisions could be swayed by smaller, more vocal groups. Interestingly, Athens wasn't the only Greek city-state experimenting with governance. Just a few miles away, Sparta took a dramatically different approach. Instead of democracy, Sparta embraced a rigid oligarchy where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. This contrast highlights just how innovative and contentious Athens' system truly was. While Sparta prioritized military discipline and hierarchy, Athens championed debate, participation, and the ideals of civic duty. Yet both systems, in their own ways, shaped the political landscape of the ancient world. What can we learn from Athens' experiment? While its democracy was far from perfect, it laid the groundwork for the principles we value today: equality before the law, the right to participate in governance, and the belief that power should reside with the people. Yet it also serves as a reminder that true democracy requires constant effort to include and represent all members of society. As we explore other early forms of governance, Athens stands as a testament to both the promise and the challenges of democracy in its earliest days. The Roman Republic stands as one of history's most influential experiments in governance, laying the groundwork for many of the democratic principles we recognize today. Unlike the direct democracy of ancient Athens, where citizens voted on every issue, Rome introduced the concept of representative democracy. Instead of everyone participating directly in decision-making, elected officials like senators and consuls acted on behalf of the people. This system allowed a sprawling empire to manage its affairs more efficiently, while still giving citizens a voice in their government. At the heart of this structure was a carefully balanced distribution of power. The Roman Republic divided authority among different branches, each designed to check and balance the others. The Senate, composed of Rome's elite, advised on policy and foreign affairs, while consuls, elected annually, served as the chief executives, commanding the military and overseeing daily governance. Meanwhile, the plebeian council represented the common people, ensuring their interests weren't completely overshadowed by the aristocracy. This intricate balance wasn't perfect. Conflicts between classes were common, but it created a framework that prevented any single group from dominating entirely. One of the most striking examples of Roman values in action is the story of Cincinnatus. In a time of crisis, this farmer-turned-leader was appointed dictator, a temporary position with absolute power. But rather than cling to authority, Cincinnatus relinquished it as soon as the threat passed, returning to his plow. His selflessness became a symbol of civic virtue, embodying the ideal that power should serve the people, not the individual. Stories like this highlight how deeply the Romans valued duty, honor, and the greater good, principles that still resonate in modern democracies. The influence of the Roman Republic on later societies is hard to overstate. Its emphasis on representation, checks and balances, and civic responsibility shaped the development of governments across Europe and beyond. The framers of the United States Constitution, for example, drew heavily on Roman ideas, adapting them to fit a new era. But Rome wasn't the only society to build on these concepts. Over time, other cultures took these foundational ideas and molded them to suit their own needs, creating a rich tapestry of governance that continues to evolve even today. Religion and governance have always been deeply intertwined, and in the ancient world, this connection was especially powerful. Take ancient Egypt, for example. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was considered a living god, a bridge between the divine and the earthly. But even in societies where leaders weren't seen as gods, religious figures often held immense sway. In Mesopotamia, priests weren't just spiritual guides. They were advisors to kings, interpreters of divine will, and sometimes even mediators in disputes. Their influence extended into every corner of governance, from crafting laws to declaring war. This wasn't just about faith, it was about legitimacy. Rulers relied on religious leaders to justify their power, often claiming their authority came directly from the gods. But here's where things get interesting. While religion provided a framework for order, it sometimes clashed with the early seeds of democracy. Think about the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece. This sacred site wasn't just a place for spiritual guidance, it was a political powerhouse. Leaders from across the Greek world would seek the oracle's advice before making major decisions, from launching wars to drafting treaties. The oracle's words carried divine weight, but they also shaped the political landscape in ways that weren't always democratic. After all, if a decision was said to come from the gods, who could argue with it? This tension between divine authority and human decision-making was a defining feature of many ancient societies. Yet, over time, some civilizations began to move toward more secular systems. In ancient Athens, for instance, the rise of democracy marked a shift away from religious dominance in governance. Decisions were made by citizens, not priests, and the idea of collective human reasoning started to take precedence over divine decree. This wasn't an overnight change. Religion still played a role, but it represented a pivotal moment in the evolution of political systems. So, what can we take from this? Religion undeniably shaped the foundations of early governance, providing structure and legitimacy. But as societies grew more complex, the balance of power began to shift. The rise of secular systems didn't erase the influence of religion, but it did open the door for new ideas about how people could govern themselves. And that's where the story of democracy truly begins to unfold. Trade and commerce played a surprisingly pivotal role in shaping early democratic practices, especially in societies where economic interdependence created a need for collaboration and fairness. Take the Phoenicians, for example. As master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, they didn't just exchange goods, they exchanged ideas. Their bustling ports became hubs where people from different cultures and backgrounds interacted, fostering a sense of shared responsibility. To manage the complexities of trade, merchants often formed councils to regulate commerce, settle disputes, and set fair standards. These councils weren't just about business. They were early experiments in collective decision-making, where diverse voices had to be heard to keep trade flowing smoothly. The Indus Valley civilization offers another fascinating example. Known for its advanced urban planning and extensive trade networks, this society relied heavily on cooperation to maintain its economic stability. Archaeological evidence suggests that decisions about resource distribution, trade routes, and even infrastructure were made through collaborative processes. This kind of shared governance wasn't just practical, it reflected a growing understanding that economic success depended on balancing the interests of many, rather than relying on the authority of a single ruler. But why did trade have such a democratizing effect? One reason is simple: money talks. In societies where wealth was tied to commerce, merchants and traders held significant influence. They needed systems that protected their interests, and those systems often involved negotiation, compromise, and representation. Over time, these practices spilled over into broader governance, laying the groundwork for more inclusive forms of decision-making. Interestingly, this economic interdependence didn't just encourage cooperation, it also created a sense of accountability. When trade networks spanned vast distances, rulers and councils had to ensure stability and fairness to keep the economy thriving. This often meant listening to the concerns of merchants and traders, who could disrupt commerce if their needs weren't met. In this way, trade didn't just build wealth, it built bridges between different groups, fostering a culture of dialogue and mutual respect. As we explore the connection between trade and democracy, it's worth noting how military needs also played a role in shaping governance. Just as commerce required cooperation, defending a society against external threats often demanded unified decision-making. This intersection of economic and military pressures would prove crucial in the development of early democratic systems, as we'll see next. Military alliances in the ancient world weren't just about strength in numbers, they were also incubators for democratic ideas. Take the Delian League, for example, a coalition of Greek city-states formed in the 5th century BCE to counter Persian threats. While it's often remembered for Athens' dominance, this alliance also demanded cooperation. Each member state had a voice, and decisions about war, peace, and shared resources were made collectively. This need for collaboration gave rise to councils where representatives from different cities debated and voted on critical issues. It wasn't perfect, power imbalances existed, but it laid the groundwork for systems where multiple voices could shape policy. The Roman Republic offers another fascinating example. Early Rome's military success relied heavily on alliances with neighboring tribes and cities, known as the Latin League. These alliances weren't just military pacts, they required mutual agreements on governance and shared responsibilities. Over time, Rome's leaders realized that keeping allies loyal meant granting them some degree of political participation. This led to the creation of legal frameworks that allowed allied cities to maintain their local governments while still contributing to Rome's broader goals. It was a delicate balance, but it showed how military necessity could push societies toward more inclusive decision-making. War and peace played a paradoxical role in shaping democratic practices. On one hand, the urgency of defense often forced societies to streamline decision-making, sometimes centralizing power. But on the other hand, the need to maintain unity among diverse groups encouraged the development of systems where multiple stakeholders had a say. This tension between efficiency and inclusivity is a recurring theme in ancient governance. It's a reminder that democracy, even in its earliest forms, was rarely static. It evolved in response to the challenges and opportunities of its time. As we look at how these military alliances influenced governance, it's impossible to ignore the role of legal systems in supporting democratic practices. Laws provided the structure that made cooperation possible, ensuring that agreements between allies were more than just handshake deals. They codified rights, responsibilities, and processes for resolving disputes, creating a foundation of trust that was essential for any alliance to function. This interplay between military strategy, political cooperation, and legal frameworks reveals just how interconnected these elements were in the ancient world. And as we'll see next, the development of legal systems didn't just support democracy, it became a cornerstone of its evolution. One of the most fascinating aspects of early democratic societies is how they laid the groundwork for fair governance through written law codes. Take, for example, Hammurabi's Code, created in ancient Babylon around 1750 BCE. This monumental set of laws wasn't just a list of rules, it was a declaration that justice should be accessible and consistent for all. Hammurabi famously claimed that the laws were given to him by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers so that the strong should not harm the weak. This idea of protecting the vulnerable and ensuring fairness was revolutionary at the time. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about creating a system where everyone, regardless of status, had rights that were recognized and defended. Similarly, in ancient Rome, the 12 Tables served as the foundation of Roman law. Established around 450 BCE, these laws were carved into bronze tablets and displayed publicly so that every citizen could see and understand them. The 12 Tables covered everything from property rights to family disputes, and they emphasized the importance of transparency in governance. By making the laws accessible to the public, the Romans ensured that justice wasn't a privilege reserved for the elite, it was a right for all citizens. This idea of public participation in the legal process was a cornerstone of early democratic thought. It wasn't just about having laws, it was about making sure those laws were created and enforced with the involvement of the people they were meant to serve. But laws alone weren't enough to sustain democratic ideals. Education and philosophy played a crucial role in shaping how people understood and participated in governance. Think about ancient Athens, where philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle debated the nature of justice and the best ways to organize society. These discussions weren't just academic exercises, they were part of a broader cultural movement that encouraged citizens to think critically about their role in the community. Education wasn't just about learning to read and write. It was about cultivating the skills needed to engage in public life. This emphasis on intellectual growth and civic responsibility helped create a society where people felt empowered to contribute to the laws and systems that govern them. What's remarkable about these early legal systems is how they reflect a universal desire for fairness and accountability. Whether it was Hammurabi's Code or the 12 Tables, these laws weren't just about maintaining order. They were about building trust between rulers and the ruled. By involving citizens in the creation and enforcement of laws, these societies laid the groundwork for the democratic principles we still value today. And as we'll see next, the ideas of education and philosophy would continue to shape how people thought about governance, creating a legacy that would endure for centuries. The ancient world was not just a stage for kings and warriors, it was also a place where philosophers grappled with questions that still resonate today. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle didn't just ponder the nature of existence, they wrestled with the very idea of democracy itself. Socrates, for instance, famously questioned whether the average citizen had the wisdom to make sound decisions for the greater good. His student, Plato, took this skepticism further in his work The Republic, where he envisioned an ideal society ruled not by the many, but by philosopher kings, those who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge and virtue. Yet, even Plato recognized the importance of education in shaping citizens capable of self-governance. He believed that a well-educated populace was essential for any functioning democracy, as it equipped people with the critical thinking skills needed to navigate complex societal issues. Aristotle, on the other hand, took a more balanced approach. While he acknowledged the dangers of unchecked democracy, he also saw its potential. For him, the key lay in creating a system where power was shared among the many, but guided by laws and ethical principles. He argued that education wasn't just about learning facts, it was about cultivating virtues like fairness, empathy, and a sense of justice. These philosophical debates weren't just abstract musings, they shaped the way ancient societies approached governance. In Athens, for example, education wasn't limited to the elite. Boys from various backgrounds were taught rhetoric, logic, and ethics, skills that prepared them to participate in the assembly and the courts. This emphasis on education was revolutionary, as it recognized that democracy thrives when citizens are informed, engaged, and capable of questioning the status quo. Plato's Republic offers a fascinating lens into these ideas. In it, he describes a society where everyone has a role to play, but only those who are truly educated, those who understand the nature of justice and the common good are fit to lead. While his vision of philosopher kings might seem far removed from modern democracy, the underlying principle remains relevant. A society's strength depends on the wisdom and virtue of its people. This connection between philosophy, education, and democracy wasn't confined to Greece. As these ideas spread across the Mediterranean, they began to influence other cultures, planting the seeds for democratic thought in places like Rome and beyond. The journey of democracy, it turns out, wasn't just about systems of governance. It was about the ideas that inspired them and the people who carried those ideas forward. The Silk Road wasn't just a highway for silk, spices, and gold. It was also a bustling corridor for the exchange of ideas, including the seeds of democracy. As merchants, scholars, and travelers moved between East and West, they carried not only goods but also philosophies, political theories, and governance practices. This incredible network of trade routes connected distant societies, allowing democratic principles from ancient Greece and Rome to mingle with the traditions of Central Asia, India, and China. Take, for example, the Mauryan Empire in ancient India. Under the rule of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, the empire established councils known as Sabhas and Samitis. These assemblies were made up of representatives from various communities, tasked with advising the emperor on matters of governance and policy. While not a full democracy in the modern sense, these councils reflected a shared power structure where voices from different groups were heard and considered. This idea of collective decision-making didn't emerge in isolation. It was influenced by the Greek concept of polis, or city-state governance, which had spread eastward through the Silk Road's cultural exchanges. Further along the Silk Road in Central Asia, nomadic tribes like the Scythians and the Xiongnu developed their own systems of governance that emphasized group consensus. Leaders were often chosen through collective agreement, and decisions affecting the tribe were made in communal gatherings. These practices, while different from the structured democracies of Greece or Rome, shared a common thread: the belief that authority should be rooted in the consent of the governed. Even in China, where imperial rule dominated, there were traces of democratic thought. Confucian scholars debated the importance of meritocracy and the role of public opinion in governance. While the emperor held ultimate power, advisors and officials often sought input from local leaders and communities, creating a system where governance wasn't entirely top-down. These ideas, too, were shaped by the flow of knowledge along the Silk Road, as Chinese thinkers interacted with Greek and Roman philosophical texts brought by traders and travelers. What's fascinating is how these democratic principles weren't simply copied, they were adapted. Each society took the ideas they encountered and molded them to fit their own cultural and political context. The Silk Road didn't just spread democracy, it allowed it to evolve in unique ways across different regions. This interplay of ideas shows how interconnected ancient societies were and how the roots of democracy weren't confined to one place or people. As we explore these early democratic systems, it's clear that the Silk Road wasn't just a physical route, it was a bridge for the exchange of ideals that shaped the way societies governed themselves. And as we move forward, we'll see how these ideas continued to grow, even in places far removed from the bustling trade routes, as indigenous societies around the world developed their own democratic traditions. Long before European settlers arrived in the Americas, indigenous societies were already crafting systems of governance that emphasized collective decision-making and community harmony. One of the most striking examples comes from the Iroquois Confederacy, a union of 6 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. At the heart of their political structure was the Great Law of Peace, a constitution-like document that not only established a framework for governance, but also prioritized consensus and the well-being of all members. This wasn't just about voting or majority rule, it was about ensuring every voice was heard and every decision served the greater good. The Great Law of Peace was a revolutionary concept for its time. It created a system where leaders, known as sachems, were chosen by the people and held accountable to them. Decisions were made through lengthy discussions, with the goal of reaching unanimous agreement rather than settling for a simple majority. This emphasis on consensus meant that every member of the Confederacy had a stake in the outcome, fostering a sense of unity and shared responsibility. As one Iroquois leader famously put it, "In our councils we are all of one mind and our strength is in our unity." What's truly fascinating is how these indigenous practices may have influenced the formation of the United States Constitution. Historical records suggest that figures like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were aware of the Iroquois system and drew inspiration from its principles of balance, representation, and collective decision-making. While the exact extent of this influence is debated, it's clear that the Iroquois Confederacy offered a model of governance that valued collaboration over coercion, a concept that resonates deeply in modern democratic ideals. But the story doesn't end there. While indigenous societies in the Americas were perfecting their systems of consensus-based governance, a very different form of democracy was taking shape across the Atlantic in medieval Europe. The transition from tribal confederacies to feudal kingdoms brought new challenges and opportunities for political organization, setting the stage for the evolution of governance in ways that would eventually shape the world as we know it. So, how did medieval Europe, often seen as a time of feudalism and rigid hierarchies, plant the seeds for modern democracy? Surprisingly, it was through the rise of guilds, parliaments, and charters that the foundations of democratic governance began to take shape. Let's start with the guilds. These were associations of craftsmen and merchants who banded together to protect their trades and regulate quality. But they were more than just economic organizations. They were early experiments in collective decision-making. Members would vote on rules, elect leaders, and settle disputes, creating small-scale models of self-governance that echoed the democratic practices of ancient societies like Athens and Rome. Then there were the parliaments, which emerged as a way for rulers to consult with their subjects, especially when they needed funds for wars or other ventures. The English Parliament, for example, began as a gathering of nobles and clergy, but eventually expanded to include representatives from towns and counties. This wasn't full democracy as we know it today, but it was a significant step toward shared governance. The idea that rulers should seek consent from their people rather than impose their will unchecked was revolutionary for its time. Now let's talk about the Magna Carta, a document that's often called a cornerstone of modern democracy. Signed in 1215 by King John of England, the Magna Carta was essentially a peace treaty between the king and his rebellious barons. But its impact went far beyond that. It introduced the radical idea that even a monarch was not above the law. By limiting the king's power and establishing certain rights for his subjects, the Magna Carta laid the groundwork for constitutional governance. It wasn't a perfect document, and its immediate effects were limited, but its principles would echo through the centuries, influencing everything from the English Bill of Rights to the United States Constitution. What's fascinating is how these medieval developments were influenced by earlier democratic practices. The Magna Carta, for instance, drew on ancient Roman ideas about the rule of law, while the guilds reflected the communal decision-making seen in Greek city-states. Even the parliaments had roots in the councils of tribal societies, where leaders sought advice from their communities. It's a reminder that democracy didn't emerge in a vacuum. It evolved over time, shaped by the struggles and innovations of countless generations. Speaking of struggles, medieval Europe was no stranger to conflict over representation. Take the story of Simon de Montfort, an English nobleman who led a rebellion against King Henry III in the 13th century. De Montfort's rebellion culminated in the first elected parliament in 1265, where ordinary townspeople had a voice alongside the nobility and clergy. It was a fleeting moment, but it showed that the fight for representation was alive and well, even in an age of kings and castles. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, these democratic ideals began to flourish once more. The Renaissance, with its emphasis on humanism and the rediscovery of classical texts, revived interest in the democratic practices of ancient Greece and Rome. Thinkers like Machiavelli and Erasmus debated the nature of power and governance, while the printing press spread these ideas far and wide. It was a time of transformation as the seeds planted in the medieval period began to sprout, setting the stage for the democratic revolutions of the modern era. And that's where our story takes its next turn into the Renaissance, where the revival of ancient ideas would reshape the world in ways no one could have predicted. As the Renaissance swept across Europe, it brought with it more than just stunning art and scientific breakthroughs. It reignited a fascination with the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome. Thinkers of the time began to rediscover long-forgotten texts, works like Aristotle's Politics and Cicero's writings on justice and governance. These ancient ideas became a spark, lighting the way for a new wave of political thought. Among the most influential figures of this era were Niccolo Machiavelli and Thomas More, two men who wrestled with questions of power, governance, and the role of the individual in society. Machiavelli, often misunderstood, didn't just write about the ruthless exercise of power in The Prince. He also explored the delicate balance between authority and the consent of the governed in his lesser-known work, Discourses on Livy. Meanwhile, Thomas More's Utopia painted a picture of an ideal society, one where citizens actively participated in decision-making and shared in the responsibilities of governance. These thinkers didn't just look to the past, they used ancient ideas to challenge the status quo, laying the groundwork for modern political theory. What made the Renaissance so transformative was its emphasis on the individual. For centuries, the focus had been on divine authority and feudal hierarchies, but now humanism took center stage. People began to see themselves not just as subjects to a king or pawns in a divine plan, but as active participants in shaping their own destinies. This shift in thinking wasn't just philosophical, it had real-world implications. The idea that individuals had rights and responsibilities within their communities began to take root, paving the way for more inclusive forms of governance. Civic participation, a cornerstone of ancient democracies, was reimagined for a new era, but the Renaissance was only the beginning. As these ideas spread, they set the stage for the Enlightenment, a period that would take these principles even further, challenging old systems and championing reason, liberty, and equality. The seeds planted during the Renaissance would grow into the democratic ideals we recognize today, but that's a story for the next chapter. The Enlightenment wasn't just a time of scientific discovery. It was a revolution of the mind that reshaped how people thought about power, freedom, and governance. Thinkers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Montesquieu dared to question the status quo, arguing that authority shouldn't come from divine right or brute force, but from the consent of the governed. Their ideas became the foundation for modern democracy, sparking movements that would change the course of history. Locke, for instance, famously argued that every individual has natural rights to life, liberty, and property, ideas that would later echo in the Declaration of Independence. Rousseau took it a step further, proposing that true freedom comes from a collective agreement, or what he called the social contract. In his words, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. He believed that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. Montesquieu, on the other hand, introduced the idea of separating powers into branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, a concept that's now a cornerstone of democratic systems worldwide. These thinkers didn't just write abstract theories, their ideas fueled real-world change. The American Revolution, with its rallying cry of "no taxation without representation," drew heavily from Locke's philosophy. Similarly, the French Revolution's call for liberty, equality, fraternity was steeped in Rousseau's vision of a society built on mutual consent. Both revolutions were experiments in putting Enlightenment ideals into practice, testing whether societies could govern themselves through reason and shared principles rather than tradition or tyranny. But what made the social contract so revolutionary? It wasn't just about limiting the power of rulers, it was about redefining the relationship between the governed and those in power. For the first time, leaders were seen as servants of the people, accountable to the will of the majority. This shift didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't without struggle. Yet, it laid the groundwork for the democratic systems we recognize today, where the balance of power is constantly negotiated and the voice of the people holds weight. As we'll see, these ideas didn't stop at theory or revolution. They evolved, shaping the way nations are built and governed. The Enlightenment proved that ideas, when powerful enough, can transform the world. And its legacy continues to challenge us to think critically about the kind of society we want to create. The American Revolution wasn't just a fight for independence. It was a bold experiment in democracy, one that drew inspiration from both ancient traditions and Enlightenment ideals. Thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu had already laid the groundwork, arguing for concepts like natural rights, the separation of powers, and the importance of representation. But the Founding Fathers didn't just copy these ideas, they adapted them to fit the realities of a new nation. The result, a revolutionary system that sought to balance power in ways never before seen on such a scale. At the heart of this experiment was the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, a document that aimed to create a government strong enough to function but limited enough to prevent tyranny. It wasn't an easy process. Delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 clashed over issues like state representation, leading to compromises like the Great Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. These decisions, while necessary to secure unity, revealed the inherent tensions in building a democratic system, tensions that would continue to shape American politics for centuries. But the Constitution was just the beginning. The Bill of Rights, added in 1791, addressed concerns about individual freedoms and the limits of government power. These first 10 amendments were a direct response to fears of federal overreach, a reminder that democracy thrives when power is checked and citizens are protected. Yet, even with these safeguards, the balance between state and federal authority remained a contentious issue. The debates between Federalists who favored a strong central government and anti-Federalists who championed states' rights were fierce. Figures like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson became the faces of this ideological divide, their arguments echoing the broader struggle to define what democracy should look like in practice. What's fascinating is how these early struggles set the stage for democracy's global spread. The American experiment became a model, inspiring movements for self-governance and constitutionalism around the world. From Europe to Latin America, nations began to adopt similar frameworks, blending ancient and Enlightenment principles with their own unique contexts. The challenges of balancing power, protecting rights, and fostering unity that the U.S. faced were not unique, they were universal, part of the ongoing story of how societies strive to govern themselves fairly and effectively. And that story, as we'll see, continues to evolve in surprising ways. The French Revolution, often hailed as a turning point in the struggle for democracy, was a bold attempt to dismantle centuries of monarchy and inequality. At its heart was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a groundbreaking document that declared liberty, equality, and fraternity as the cornerstones of a new society. Proclaimed in 1789, this declaration was revolutionary in its assertion that all men are born free and equal in rights. It was a direct challenge to the old order, promising a world where power no longer resided solely in the hands of kings and nobles. But as history often shows, ideals can clash with reality. While the declaration inspired hope, the revolution quickly spiraled into chaos. Leaders like Maximilien Robespierre, who once championed the rights of the people, began to wield power with terrifying authority. The Reign of Terror, a period marked by mass executions and political purges, revealed the darker side of revolutionary fervor. As Robespierre himself famously said, "Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible." This stark contradiction between the revolution's lofty ideals and its brutal actions underscored the immense challenges of translating democratic principles into practice. The French Revolution also exposed the fragility of unity in the face of competing interests. While the Declaration of the Rights of Man aimed to unify all citizens under shared values, the reality was far more fractured. Peasants, urban workers, and the bourgeoisie each had different visions of what equality and freedom should look like. And as the revolution progressed, these divisions only deepened, leading to internal conflicts that threatened to undermine the very democracy it sought to build. Yet, despite its struggles, the revolution left an indelible mark on the world. It planted the seeds of modern democracy, inspiring movements for equality and self-governance across Europe and beyond. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen became a blueprint for future constitutions, influencing democratic thought well into the 19th century. Even as the revolution's excesses served as a cautionary tale, its ideals continued to resonate, reminding us that the path to democracy is rarely straightforward. As we move into the 19th century, we see how these revolutionary ideas evolved, shaping new political systems and sparking further debates about the true meaning of democracy. The French Revolution may have been tumultuous, but its legacy endures, a testament to the enduring human desire for freedom and equality. The 19th century was a time of seismic change, not just in how people worked and lived, but in how they governed themselves. As factories sprang up and cities swelled with workers, the very fabric of society was rewoven, and democracy had to adapt. Industrialization and urbanization didn't just transform economies, they reshaped politics, creating both opportunities and tensions that would define the modern democratic era. Take Britain, for example, where the Industrial Revolution first took root. As factories brought people together in densely packed urban centers, a new class of workers emerged, people who toiled long hours but had little say in the political system. Yet, these workers weren't content to stay silent. The 19th century saw the rise of labor movements, organized groups demanding fair wages, safer working conditions, and crucially, the right to vote. These movements became a driving force behind the expansion of democracy, pushing governments to recognize that the voices of ordinary citizens could no longer be ignored. This push for political inclusion led to landmark reforms like Britain's Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884. These acts gradually extended voting rights beyond the wealthy elite, first to middle-class property owners and eventually to working-class men. But these changes didn't come without resistance. Many in power feared that expanding the franchise would destabilize society, leading to chaos or even revolution. And yet, the reforms passed, proving that democracy could evolve to meet the demands of a changing world. But this evolution wasn't without its challenges. While the expansion of voting rights was a step forward, it was also a reminder of how deeply inequality was embedded in the system. Women, for instance, were still excluded from the ballot box, and the fight for their suffrage would become one of the defining struggles of the early 20th century. Similarly, the labor movements that fought so hard for workers' rights often faced violent opposition from employers and governments alike. Democracy, in this era, was both a beacon of progress and a battleground of competing interests. By the end of the 19th century, democracy had taken on a new shape, one that reflected the realities of an industrialized, urbanized world. Yet, as the 20th century dawned, it became clear that the challenges were far from over. The rapid pace of change had brought new questions about who should have a voice in government and how that voice should be heard. And as the world entered an era of global conflict and technological innovation, democracy would face its greatest tests yet. The 20th century was a time of both profound crisis and remarkable triumph for democracy. As the world grappled with the rise of totalitarian regimes during the World Wars and the Cold War, the very foundations of democratic ideals were put to the test. Leaders like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and later figures in authoritarian states sought to dismantle freedom, suppress dissent, and centralize power in ways that directly opposed the principles of democracy. Yet, amid the darkness, democratic nations rallied together, determined to defend their values and push back against tyranny. Winston Churchill, the indomitable British Prime Minister, famously declared during World War II, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender." These words became a rallying cry, embodying the resilience of democratic societies in the face of overwhelming odds. But the struggle for democracy didn't end with the defeat of fascism. The Cold War introduced a new kind of ideological battle, pitting democratic ideals against the spread of communism. This era saw democracies like the United States and its allies working tirelessly to contain the influence of the Soviet Union, not just through military might, but by promoting freedom and human rights as universal values. It was a time when the world watched closely as democratic nations sought to prove that open societies could thrive, even in the shadow of nuclear threats and geopolitical tension. Yet, the fight for democracy wasn't just about external threats, it was also about confronting internal injustices. The civil rights movement in the United States, for example, became a defining moment in the evolution of democratic ideals. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. challenged the status quo, demanding that the promise of democracy, equality, justice, and freedom be extended to all citizens regardless of race. King's iconic "I Have a Dream" speech echoed the aspirations of millions, reminding the world that democracy is not a static concept but a living ideal that must continually expand to include those who have been marginalized. Nelson Mandela, too, played a pivotal role in demonstrating the power of democratic principles. After spending 27 years in prison for his fight against apartheid in South Africa, Mandela emerged not with bitterness but with a vision of reconciliation. His leadership showed that democracy could heal deep divisions and bring people together, even after decades of oppression. Mandela once said, "To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." His words remind us that democracy is not just about systems of government, but about the values we choose to uphold. As we reflect on these historic struggles and triumphs, it's clear that democracy is not a finished project, it's a work in progress. Even today, democratic nations face new challenges, from the rise of populism to the erosion of trust in institutions. Yet, just as the 20th century showed us, democracy has an incredible capacity to adapt and evolve. The lessons of the past remind us that defending democratic values requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And as we look to the future, it's up to all of us to ensure that democracy continues to grow, not just as a system of governance, but as a promise of freedom and equality for generations to come. Modern democracy, while a cornerstone of many societies today, faces a unique set of challenges that test its resilience and adaptability. Issues like economic inequality, political polarization, and the rapid rise of technology have reshaped how we engage with governance and one another. Take inequality, for example. In many democracies, the gap between the wealthy and the poor has widened, creating tensions that threaten social cohesion. This isn't just about money, it's about access to opportunities, representation, and the sense that everyone's voice matters equally. Then there's polarization, which has deepened divides in ways that can feel almost insurmountable. Political discourse, once a space for debate and compromise, has become increasingly hostile. Social media plays a huge role here. Platforms designed to connect us have also amplified echo chambers where opposing views are drowned out or dismissed entirely. The Arab Spring protests, for instance, showed how social media could mobilize masses for positive change. But recent elections in various countries have also revealed how misinformation and targeted campaigns can sow discord and erode trust in democratic institutions. Yet, even as these challenges mount, there's an opportunity to look back at the roots of democracy for guidance. Ancient societies like Athens didn't have the tools we have today, but they grappled with similar questions. How do you ensure fairness? How do you balance individual freedoms with collective good? Their focus on civic participation and dialogue offers a blueprint for modern solutions. For example, participatory budgeting, a practice where citizens have a direct say in how public funds are spent, echoes the Athenian emphasis on involving people in decision-making. And let's not forget that democracy isn't a one-size-fits-all system. While Western democracies often dominate the conversation, non-Western societies offer fascinating insights into how democratic principles can be adapted to different cultural contexts. Take India, the world's largest democracy, where a diverse population with hundreds of languages and cultures manages to uphold democratic processes. Or look at Botswana, often hailed as a success story in Africa, where stable governance and respect for institutions have fostered growth and stability. These examples remind us that democracy is a living, evolving concept, one that can thrive in many forms, as long as its core principles of equality, participation, and accountability are upheld. As we navigate these challenges and opportunities, the lessons from both ancient and modern democracies remind us that the system is only as strong as the people who sustain it. Whether through technology, policy, or grassroots movements, the future of democracy depends on our ability to adapt, innovate, and stay true to the ideals that have guided it for centuries. While democracy is often associated with Western traditions, its roots and adaptations stretch far beyond Europe and North America. Across the globe, nations have taken the principles of self-governance and tailored them to fit their unique histories, cultures, and values. This blending of democratic ideals with local traditions has created rich and diverse models of governance that reflect the complexity of human societies. Take India, for example. As the world's largest democracy, it has woven democratic practices into a society that is deeply rooted in ancient traditions. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi emphasized the importance of self-rule and grassroots participation, famously saying, "The true democracy cannot be worked by 20 men sitting at the center. It has to be worked from below by the people of every village." This vision shaped India's democratic framework, where village councils or panchayats play a vital role in local decision-making. Yet, India's democracy also faces challenges balancing diversity, addressing inequality, and navigating the complexities of a rapidly modernizing society. Similarly, South Africa's democracy emerged from a history of colonialism and apartheid. After decades of struggle, the nation adopted a constitution often hailed as one of the most progressive in the world. It enshrines not only political rights but also social and economic freedoms, reflecting the values of Ubuntu, a philosophy that emphasizes interconnectedness and community. Yet, even with these ideals, South Africa continues to grapple with issues like corruption and inequality, showing that democracy is a journey, not a destination. Then there's Japan, where democracy blends with deeply ingrained cultural values like harmony and consensus. The Japanese system emphasizes collective decision-making and stability, often prioritizing long-term planning over rapid change. This approach has allowed Japan to maintain one of the most stable democracies in Asia, but it also raises questions about how to balance tradition with the need for innovation in a fast-changing world. What these examples show is that democracy is not a one-size-fits-all system. It evolves, adapts, and takes on different forms depending on the cultural, historical, and social context of each society. And as we look to the future, the question becomes, how can democratic practices continue to grow and respond to the challenges of our time? From climate change to technological advancements, the next chapter of democracy will require creativity, resilience, and a commitment to the values that unite us all. As we look to the future, democracy stands at a crossroads, shaped by forces that were unimaginable to its earliest architects. Technology, climate change, and globalization are not just reshaping our world, they're redefining how we govern ourselves. The rise of digital tools, for instance, has opened up entirely new ways for people to participate in decision-making. Imagine a world where citizens can vote on local budgets through an app or propose policies via online platforms. This isn't science fiction, it's already happening. Cities like Reykjavik and Paris have experimented with participatory budgeting, allowing residents to directly influence how public funds are spent. These innovations hint at a future where democracy becomes more inclusive, dynamic, and responsive to the needs of the people. But with great potential comes great challenges. The same technology that empowers citizens can also be weaponized to undermine trust in democratic institutions. Disinformation campaigns, fueled by social media algorithms, have the power to distort reality and polarize societies. And as authoritarian regimes harness surveillance tools to suppress dissent, the very freedoms that democracy protects are under threat. This duality, innovation versus exploitation, forces us to ask, how can we harness the best of technology while guarding against its dangers? Climate change adds another layer of complexity. As rising sea levels and extreme weather events displace communities, governments will face unprecedented pressure to respond quickly and equitably. Democracy, with its deliberative processes, may seem slow in the face of such urgent crises. Yet, history shows us that collective decision-making, when done right, can lead to sustainable solutions. Ancient societies like the Iroquois Confederacy relied on consensus building to address long-term challenges, a lesson that resonates today as we grapple with global environmental threats. Globalization, too, presents both opportunities and risks. On one hand, it connects us like never before, fostering collaboration across borders. On the other, it can exacerbate inequalities and create power imbalances that strain democratic systems. The challenge lies in ensuring that globalization benefits everyone, not just the privileged few. So, what can we learn from the past to navigate this uncertain future? Ancient democracies thrived because they adapted to their circumstances, balancing tradition with innovation. They remind us that democracy is not a static system but a living one, constantly evolving to meet the needs of its people. As we confront the challenges of the 21st century, these lessons from history can serve as a compass, guiding us toward a future where democracy is not just preserved but revitalized. Ancient democracies, like those in Athens and Rome, weren't just relics of the past, they were laboratories of civic innovation, and their lessons still resonate today. One of the most enduring takeaways is the value of civic participation. In ancient Athens, citizens didn't just vote, they actively debated, served on juries, and even rotated into public office. This wasn't just about governance, it was about building a society where everyone had a stake. Historian Josiah Ober put it best when he said, "Democracy thrives when citizens see themselves not as passive subjects, but as active architects of their community." Sound familiar? In a world where voter apathy and disengagement are growing concerns, this ancient principle reminds us that democracy isn't a spectator sport, it's a collective effort. Another key lesson is the rule of law. Ancient societies understood that laws shouldn't favor the powerful, they should protect everyone equally. In Rome, the 12 Tables, a foundational legal code, ensured that even the elite were bound by the same rules as ordinary citizens. This idea of fairness and accountability is timeless. Today, as we grapple with issues like corruption and inequality, the rule of law remains a cornerstone of any functioning democracy. It's not just about having laws, it's about ensuring they're applied justly and consistently. Balanced governance was also a hallmark of these early systems. The Athenians, for example, were wary of concentrating too much power in one place. They divided authority among different bodies, creating checks and balances to prevent abuse. This principle of shared power is something modern democracies still rely on, from the separation of powers in the United States to parliamentary systems in Europe. But balance isn't just about institutions, it's about fostering dialogue and compromise. As historian Mary Beard notes, democracy works best when it's a conversation, not a monologue. So, what does all this mean for us today? These ancient principles aren't just historical curiosities, they're tools for addressing modern challenges. Civic participation can help bridge the gap between governments and the governed. The rule of law can restore trust in institutions, and balanced governance can prevent the kind of polarization that tears societies apart. But here's the thing, these ideas only work if we actively engage with them. Democracy isn't a given, it's something we have to nurture, protect, and constantly reimagine. As we reflect on these lessons, it's worth asking ourselves, how can we, as individuals, contribute to the health of our democracies? What small actions, like voting, volunteering, or even just staying informed, can make a difference? Because in the end, the story of democracy isn't just about the past, it's about the choices we make today and the future we want to build. So, how can you take the lessons of ancient democracies and apply them to your own life today? The answer lies in embracing the principles that have stood the test of time: participation, dialogue, and collective action. One of the most direct ways to engage with democratic ideals is through voting. It's not just a right, it's a responsibility. Every vote is a voice, a way to shape the future of your community and beyond. And while it might feel like a small act, history shows us that when people come together to vote, they can create monumental change. Think about the grassroots movements that have reshaped societies, whether it was the fight for civil rights or the push for gender equality. These movements didn't start with grand gestures. They began with individuals showing up and making their voices heard. But democracy isn't just about casting a ballot. It's also about staying informed and engaged. Take the time to understand the issues that matter to you, and don't be afraid to ask questions or challenge assumptions. In ancient Athens, citizens were expected to debate and deliberate, to weigh different perspectives before making decisions. You can do the same by joining community meetings, attending local council sessions, or even starting conversations with friends and neighbors. Dialogue is the lifeblood of democracy. It's how we find common ground, even when we don't see eye to eye. And remember, compromise isn't a weakness, it's a strength. It's what allows diverse voices to coexist and collaborate toward shared goals. Another powerful way to participate is through community organizing. Grassroots movements have always been at the heart of democratic change. Look at the success of initiatives like the environmental cleanups led by local volunteers or the mutual aid networks that emerged during times of crisis. These efforts prove that small actions, when multiplied, can lead to big results. You don't need to be a politician or a public figure to make a difference. Sometimes it's as simple as organizing a neighborhood cleanup or starting a petition for a cause you care about. Every effort counts, and every step forward builds momentum. As we reflect on the journey of democracy, from the ancient agora to the modern polling booth, it's clear that its strength lies in the hands of the people. The choices we make, the conversations we have, and the actions we take all contribute to the health of our societies. So, whether it's voting in an election, joining a community group, or simply staying informed, remember that your participation matters. Democracy isn't just a system, it's a shared responsibility, a collective effort to create a better future. And just like those ancient societies, we have the power to shape it one small action at a time. From the bustling agora of Athens to the modern ballot box, democracy has traveled a remarkable journey. What began as a bold experiment in ancient Greece, where citizens gathered to debate and decide the fate of their city-state, has evolved into a global ideal. Over centuries, democratic principles have weathered storms, tyranny, corruption, and inequality, yet they've endured, proving their resilience and adaptability. Think about it, democracy isn't just a system. It's a living, breathing idea that thrives on participation, accountability, and the constant push to balance power. But this journey hasn't been without its challenges. From the Roman Republic's struggles with oligarchy to the Enlightenment thinkers who reimagined governance, democracy has always been a work in progress. It's a system that demands vigilance, where the fight to protect individual rights and ensure fairness is never truly finished. As the philosopher John Dewey once said, democracy is not a state, it is an act. It's something we must actively nurture, defend, and adapt to the needs of each generation. Today, we see democracy's principles tested in new ways through technology, misinformation, and shifting global dynamics. Yet, at its core, the essence remains the same, the belief that power should rest with the people. This enduring idea, born in the ancient world, continues to inspire and challenge us. It reminds us that democracy is not a destination but a journey, one that requires courage, collaboration, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As we prepare to wrap up, let's take a moment to reflect on what this journey means for us today. How do we, as individuals and societies, contribute to this ongoing story? What lessons can we draw from the past to shape a more inclusive and equitable future? The answers lie not just in history books, but in the choices we make every day. Democracy, after all, is as much about us as it is about the systems we create. As we wrap up this exploration of ancient democratic practices, it's worth reflecting on just how much these early systems have shaped the world we live in today. From the assembly halls of Athens to the tribal councils of the Iroquois, the roots of democracy run deep, reminding us that the desire for collective decision-making is as old as civilization itself. These ancient societies, though separated by time and geography, shared a common belief in the power of voices coming together to shape their futures, a principle that still resonates in modern governance. Understanding these origins isn't just about looking back, it's about drawing lessons for the present and future. Ancient democracies weren't perfect. They grappled with exclusion, inequality, and the challenges of balancing power. Yet, they also demonstrated the incredible potential of people working together to solve problems, make decisions, and hold leaders accountable. Today, as we face our own challenges in governance, these ancient experiments remind us that democracy is a living, evolving system, one that requires participation, vigilance, and innovation to thrive. So, what can we take from these historical foundations? For starters, they remind us that democracy is not a given. It's a practice, a commitment, and a responsibility. Whether it's voting in elections, engaging in local councils, or simply having conversations about the issues that matter, each of us has a role to play in keeping the spirit of democracy alive. The ancients may have laid the groundwork, but it's up to us to build on it, adapt it, and ensure it serves everyone. As we close, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you see the legacy of ancient democratic practices influencing the way we approach governance today? What role do you think individuals can play in shaping the future of democracy? Share your ideas in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. And if you found this journey through history as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore more videos that dive into the stories and systems that have shaped our world. Together, we can keep the flame of democracy burning bright. What role will you play in shaping its future?